If you have your Bibles, turn to Luke chapter 6. We're now in Luke chapter 6. And we're going to spend this week and a bit of next week talking about the Sabbath. If you've read through the Gospels, you'll know that this was a highly contentious issue between Jesus and the Pharisees. They butted heads on this issue time and time again, how it should be kept. We're going to see a little bit of how Jesus thought it should be kept, and we're going to see a little bit today of how they thought it should be kept. Verses 1 to 5. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now we saw last week the Pharisees, they were it was something they did regularly. They made up laws and rules about all kinds of different things. Last week they saw that they had made up extra rules about fasting. According to the Day of Atonement, you had to fast once every year. The Pharisees, they added to that, and they were fasting twice a week, and they were not just fasting twice a week, but they were expecting other people to also be fasting twice a week. They had there are other areas in which they had made up rules. Hand washing was one of them. Find this passage in the book of Matthew chapter 15, 1 to 2. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Law of Moses did not require you to wash your hands before you eat. There are certain ceremonial laws. If you touch something dead or something like that, you're considered unclean. You had to do this, that, or the other thing to be considered clean again. But there's no rule on the books saying that you had to wash your hands before eating. But the Pharisees, they had made up this rule, and they abide by it, and they're expecting everyone else, to abide by it as well. The area of life, though, where the Pharisees made up the most rules and regulations wasn't in regards to fasting. It was not in regards to hand washing. It was in regards to the Sabbath. They had rules. The Sabbath, friends, just to give you a quick history, it was instituted by God. Right at the very beginning, at the beginning of creation, God made the world in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. You find this in Genesis. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And he instructed, if you fast forward a little bit, you fast forward actually to the 10 Commandments. He instructed the Israelites to do as he did. They were to work 6 days, and then they were to take a Sabbath. They were to rest on the last day. It's in Exodus 28 to 11. This is the fourth of the 10 Commandments. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates." And here's why. Here's where the commandment is grounded in. "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." He had worked 6 days and rested for one. Now, God being all-powerful, does he have to take a break? Does he have to rest one day of the week? No, he didn't. He didn't have to do that at all. Why did he do it? Because he's creating a pattern for the Israelites to follow. He's saying, I did this, you are to do this as well. You work 6 days, you rest for one. And I just add as a footnote here, because I think this point gets missed sometimes when we look at this verse. It does say, friends, 6 days you shall labor and do your work. There's usually not a whole lot of focus on that particular part. Mostly there is focus on the part where it says, and you're to rest for one day. But There is the instruction here. You are to be working for 6 days of the week. You and I are to be living productive lives. If you are, for example, if you are a husband, you're a dad, you're supposed to be out there making a living for your family. Even if you're retired and you don't have a 9 to 5, you're supposed to be living a productive life, serving God, serving others, serving the church. He didn't put you on the earth to rest for 6 days and work for 1. But sometimes there are some people that kind of gets turned around a little bit. Now there are some people, it kind of maybe depending upon the way they're wired, they work for 6 days and the temptation is to start working for the 7th too, because they're go, 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 go. And that person needs to be told, you know what, work 6 days, rest for 1. Other people, they're kind of inclined to flip it. They're going to rest for 6 days and work for 1. And they need to be reminded, you're not supposed to be doing that. You're supposed to be living a productive life, serving God, serving others, contributing, and then you get to rest for 1 day. Now, in the law of Moses, because we're talking mainly about the Sabbath here. We're not talking about the 6 days of the work week. We're talking about the Sabbath day, the day of rest here. In the law of Moses, there were rules about how this was to be kept. It wasn't just a free-for-all. You couldn't do whatever in the world you wanted. I'll give you just a few of them here. Exodus 35:3, do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Numbers 15:32 and 36. While the Israelites were in the desert, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath. So the assembly, and I'm just fast forwarding, I didn't include the whole part here. This is verse 36. So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as the Lord commanded Moses. He's working on the Sabbath here. This is what the Lord says. This is Jeremiah 17:21-22. Be careful not to carry a load on the Sabbath day or bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your houses or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your forefathers. These are just some basic rules that they had to keep in regards to it so that they wouldn't be out working on the Sabbath. What the Pharisees did, and again it was a classical Pharisaical thing to do, was to create even more laws around the Sabbath than what were already there. And they spared nothing in regards to this. They went right over the top. So I'm actually just going to read you. This is a fairly significant portion here, actually, from MacArthur's commentary. This is what the Pharisees had turned it into, okay? The Sabbath was originally given by God in the Mosaic law to be a day of rest. But by the 1st century, it had accumulated an enormous number of extra-biblical restrictions and regulations, so much so that it had become the most oppressive and burdensome day of the week. The Talmud devotes 24 chapters to Sabbath regulations, describing in painfully exhaustive detail what was and was not permitted to be done. The result was a ridiculously complex system of external behavior restraints, so much so that one rabbi spent 2.5 years studying just one of the 24 chapters. For example, traveling more than 3,000 feet from home was forbidden. But if one had placed food at the 3,000-foot point before the Sabbath, that point would then be considered a home since there was food there and allow another 3,000 feet of travel. Similarly, a piece of wood or a rope placed across the end of a narrow street or alley constituted a doorway. That could then be considered the front door of one's house and permit the 3,000 feet of travel to begin there. There were also other regulations about carrying items. Something lifted up in a public place could only be set down in a private place and vice versa. An object tossed into the air could be caught with the same hand, but if it was caught with the other, it would be a Sabbath violation. In other words, no baseball on the Sabbath because you're throwing with one hand and catching with your glove hand. They couldn't do it. I mean, if you could throw with one hand and then quickly put the glove on that hand and catch with that hand too, then you're okay, because it was with the same hand. But if it's with two, that didn't work. You see how petty this gets. If a person had reached out to pick up food when the Sabbath began, the food had to be dropped. To bring the arm back while holding the food would be to carry a burden on the Sabbath. It was forbidden to carry anything heavier than a dried fig, though something weighing half as much could be carried 2 times. A tailor could not carry his needle, a scribe his pen, or a student his books. Only enough ink to write 2 letters of the alphabet could be carried. A letter could not be sent, not even with a non-Jew. Clothes could not be examined or shaken out before being put on, because an insect might be killed in the process, which would be work. No fire could be lit or put out. Cold water could be poured into warm water, but not warm into cold. An egg could not be cooked, not even by placing it in hot sand during the summer. Nothing could be sold or bought. Bathing was forbidden, lest water be spilled on the floor and wash it. Moving a chair was not allowed, since it might make a rut in a dirt floor, which was too much like plowing. Women were forbidden to look in a mirror, since if they saw a white hair, they might be tempted to pull it out. Other forbidden things involve sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, grinding, kneading, baking, shearing, washing, beating, dyeing, or spinning wool, trying to untie a knot, catching, killing, or skinning a deer, salting its meat, or preparing its skin. Now, I read that and I feel just exhausted just having to read all of that. It's exhausting just thinking about all of that. Imagine if you had to do all of that. There's no wonder this had turned into the most oppressive day of the week. Basically, you can sit there and breathe. And that's about it. There's a reason Jesus said, "And you experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry." That is burdensome, that long list right there. And that's not all of it. "And you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them." It's actually that last line there that's very telling. You lift people, you place burdens on people, but you won't even lift one finger to help them carry that burden. That goes to show you right there how cruel, how loveless, how non-compassionate they were. They give you all these rules and they don't even help you obey them. It's like when someone tells you to go out and do a big job and they're just going to sit there and watch. They're not going to lift a finger to help you do it. They'll place the burden on you, but they won't help you to carry it. So, now that we have a bit of a glimpse into what the Pharisees expected of people on the Sabbath, that provides just a bit of context for our passage here. We're going to start with the objection of the Pharisees. That's point number 1, the objection of the Pharisees. And again, this is about the Sabbath and how it's supposed to be kept. Verses 1 and 2, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, 'Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?'" Now, the fields that they are walking through, these would not have been their own personal fields. They would have been traveling along, walking through other people's fields, and they are hungry. So they are taking some heads of grain. Perhaps you've done this. You rub them in your hands, the kernels come out, it's separating the wheat from the chaff, which in the Pharisees' mind, that's probably where it went wrong. Because in their minds, you're reaping, you're harvesting. You're separating the wheat from the chaff so that you can eat the wheat. Our first reaction, we might think to ourselves, they're stealing here. They're walking through fields that are not their own, picking grain. Are they stealing? Well, no, they're not actually, because according to the law of Moses, this was actually allowed. Deuteronomy 23:25, it reads, "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain." So if you're walking through someone else's field and you're hungry, you had the right. You could take a little bit of grain, some heads of grain, rub it together, eat A little bit anyways, give yourself a little bit of a snack and carry on. Obviously, you couldn't take a sickle to his standing grain because now you are harvesting his field. And you don't harvest someone else's field. It's kind of like, in modern day times, you're walking, you are allowed, let's say, to stop at a farmer's field where there are cows, and if there's a milk cow there and you're thirsty, you can milk a little bit and you can have a little bit of milk. But if you want to take that risk of doing it, but I'm just saying, it would be comparable to that. But you can't take a rifle and go shoot the animal and harvest it. That wasn't allowed. Now you're not just simply satisfying your hunger, you're actually stealing at this point. Matthew Henry, in regards to this law, he said it provided for the support of poor travelers to relieve the fatigue of their journey and teaches us to be kind to such. That be kind to such part actually there, not on the radar of the Pharisees at all. But the law required that you be kind to someone who is less fortunate. You see, for example, the same thing in Ruth. She is out there gleaning behind the reapers. Why? Because according to the law of Moses, when you're harvesting and you had left some behind, you didn't gather it all, you missed some, you couldn't just go back and get it all. You had to leave it there, actually, for the people who were poor, who were less fortunate, and they would come and glean that. The law was in place to teach people to be kind to people who were poor. This is what Jesus' disciples would have been doing. They're traveling. Law permitted them to relieve their hunger by picking some heads of grain, so that was what they did. What angered the Pharisees is that this is being done on the Sabbath, which was the day that people were not supposed to be working but resting. Here's a key point. These are the words of Matthew Henry here. This is the key point we kind of have to understand here if we're going to understand what's all going on in this text here. I'm going to come back to this point here multiple times here. Works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath day. But we must take heed that we turn not this liberty into licentiousness and abuse God's favorable concessions and condescensions to the prejudice of the work of the day. Works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath day. And even the Pharisees themselves knew that. If it was the Sabbath, okay, and their child was sick, we're assuming, of course, that they had hospitals and all that back then, but let's assume that they did. You didn't say to your child, sorry, child, it's the Sabbath, and you're deathly ill, but we can't take you because we'd have to carry you to the car, and that would be work. So we can't do that, so sorry, we can't take you. Hope you get better. They didn't do that. That's the same thing kind of, it's Sunday morning, your cows are out. They're running across the countryside, okay? You don't say, well, it's Sunday, sorry, we'll get back to this Monday morning. Yes, they're running around out on the highway, and yes, someone's probably going to get killed, but it's Sunday. Can't do it on a Sunday. It's a day of rest, sorry. No, works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath day. Jesus, he raised this point, and again, the Pharisees knew this, and Jesus raised this point with them on multiple occasions, actually. Luke 14, verse 5. Then he asked them, if one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? And they had nothing to say. Of course they did, because they would do what was necessary on the Sabbath. This next passage here is in regards to a woman who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years, but whom Jesus healed. Here's how the interaction with the Pharisees went. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, but not on the Sabbath. The Lord answered him, you hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her? When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. You can just kind of see here the sheer hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They would do what was essential. They would do works of necessity on the Sabbath. Their ox falls into a well, they would go get it out. But you, if you are hungry, you can't even rub kernels of grain together in order to give yourself a little snack so you don't pass out while you're traveling in the heat of the day. They were kind of the do as I say, not as I do. I allow for works of necessity on the Sabbath for me, for you, different story altogether. John Butler, in his commentary, he said, evil people like to accuse their enemies of the very evil of which they themselves are most guilty. This is the Pharisees here. They're accusing other people of doing this and that on the Sabbath. They were doing this and that on the Sabbath too. The thief likes to accuse his enemies of being a thief. The evil politician who raises campaign money illegally will be the first to accuse others of doing the same. And when in front of the cameras and microphones of the news media, will insist he need campaign finance reform. The most unloving people in the church will be the first to accuse others in the church of a lack of love. That's why Jesus said, and he probably had the Pharisees in mind when he said this, at least the attitude of the Pharisees anyways, from the Sermon on the Mount, and I didn't put it in the PowerPoint, but it's Matthew 7 and verse 3. Why do you look at the speck of dust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? It's a lesson to remember. Practice what you preach. Practice what you preach. And make sure that our lives aren't characterized by a double standard where we live one way but expect something different from someone else. So, works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath day. And this is, to some extent, the point that Jesus makes in response to the Pharisees. Verses 3 to 4, this is now point 2. Jesus answered them, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. This is a reference back to the passage in 1 Samuel that Helen read earlier. We'll just read a few verses here, verses 3 to 6. David, he's running from Saul. He's speaking to Abimelech, the priest, and Abimelech does not know what's going on, doesn't know why David's on the run. David actually lies to him. Now then, what do you have on hand? This is David. Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. David replied, indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the Pharisees that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. There's a reference here to consecrated bread. What is consecrated bread? Essentially, there was special bread that was placed before the presence of the Lord. It was there for 7 days, and then it was replaced with fresh bread again. And the old bread that had just been taken down, that was allowed to be eaten by the priests. You find this in Leviticus 24, 8-9. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in a holy place, because it is the most holy part of the regular share of the offerings made to the Lord by fire. You'll remember in the book of Judges there, that's where it's talked about how they would dip their fork in, and then the priests were, whatever came out of the pot, the priests were allowed to eat. Very similar thing going on here. This bread is for them as well. Yet, in a most uncustomary act, Abimelech, the priest, gave the consecrated bread to David's men to eat. And we ask the question, how was this allowed to fly? This goes against what Leviticus says here, verses 8 to 9. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, not to David and his companions, who are to eat it in a holy place. Best answer I can give you on this one. The pressing circumstances in which David and his men found themselves, in other words, they're on the run and they are hungry. That gave Abimelech justifiable cause to violate that particular custom. MacArthur, in his commentary, he said, the point of the account, the account of David and his men, which was lost on the Pharisees, was that mercy, compassion, and human need were more important than rigid adherence to even biblical ritual and ceremony. Mercy, compassion, and human need were more important in that moment. We have to remember at this point, God, He is a God of mercy. He is a God of compassion. We're sometimes told that it's the God of the Old Testament who's not loving, He's cruel, He's a bully, He's mean, He's harsh, He's judgmental. Read the Old Testament. There's an example even right here of the mercy of God towards David and his men. They are hungry, and God temporarily suspends the custom that He instituted in order that they might eat. The psalmist said, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love. Lamentations 3:22-23, because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. There are other examples of God's mercy than just the one here before us, but this is the one before us. God showed mercy to David and his men. There's no rebuke in the Old Testament offered for what Abimelech did, giving them this bread. And Jesus' words in our passage here this morning outright give David essentially the green light for what he did. They are words of approval. R.C. Sproul, in his commentary, he said, Jesus showed His approval for David's actions regarding the bread. He enunciated the principle that no ceremony outweighs the fundamental needs of human life. David and his men were not involved in an act of vandalism, nor were they in a frivolous way helping others were helping themselves to food from the altar. They were eating because they had genuine hunger and needed the bread's sustenance. May not have eaten for a day or two even. It's hard to say. It may have even actually occurred on the Sabbath, where they ate the bread from Abimelech, because it had been taken down, but it had not yet been eaten by the priests. And so Abimelech could say, well, here's the bread. It may have very well been taken down on the Sabbath. God, who is rich in mercy, friends, He temporarily allowed that custom to be suspended so that David and his men might not go hungry. And a similar thing here with Jesus and His disciples. And again, the point that we're making here, in the words of Matthew Henry, works of necessity are particularly allowed on the Sabbath day. Just as the act of Abimelech giving David the consecrated bread was allowed on the Sabbath. Jesus, He could suspend. He could suspend the law. He made it. What does He say here? Look at how He closes. This is the ultimate reason why He is able to say, my disciples are perfectly fine eating grain on the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath. He is master of it. And if He says that works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath, that means works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath. Jesus, he decreed that essentially mercy and compassion and human need are more important than rigid adherence to even biblical ritual and ceremony. Now, I was really wrestling with this one. I spent about 3 days not all day for 3 days, but I spent 3 days, the better part of those 3 days, working on this. And there's a part I ran into that really bothered me here. Works of necessity are particularly allowable on the Sabbath. And I'm just going to leave you with a couple thoughts here, because the first thing that comes into my mind is, what is a work of necessity? And who gets to define what a work of necessity is? You know, what your idea of a necessity is and what my idea of a necessity is, two very different things sometimes. The one fella, he says, I have to work on the Sunday. I have to work on that one day of rest because I need more money. Because if I don't get more money, I'm not going to be able to afford that new fishing boat. That's a need. That's a need of necessity, the new fishing boat. Another fella says, I got to do extra work because I got to have enough money because I've got 50 hunting rifles already, but I need just one more. That's a necessity. Who gets to define what a necessity is or is not? And here is where Matthew Henry, the latter part of the quote, it is actually quite instructive. We must take heed that we turn not this liberty into licentiousness and abuse God's favorable concessions and condescensions to the prejudice of the work of the day. I was talking with my dad yesterday about this passage because I was struggling with it and I decided I needed help. And so I just called him, and he was telling me, it was just the day before, because I was raising this question with him: who decides what's a necessity or not? And how do we work through that? He says, Luke, yesterday I was talking to one of the Hutterites from the colony just down the road. And the Hutterite had said they have land, and thousands of acres or whatever it is, and they had another 2,500 to go. This was 2 days ago. Another 2,500 that they had to sow. And he told my dad, we are not stopping until this is done. And my dad said, so you're going to work on Sunday then? Because there's a time when the Hutterites, they did not do that. Now they do. He said, well, yeah, and he said to my dad, yeah, we are going to work on the Sunday. And he said to my dad, according to my dad, these were his rules, these were his words: Aaron, the ox is in the well. The ox is in the well. You gotta go get it out. Referring to this passage here that we had just read, the ox is in the well. My dad kind of objected, said something to the effect of, really? The ox is in the well. And the Hutterite, he laughed a bit and he said, okay, fine, Aaron. We threw the ox in the well. Yeah. I said, Dad, he said that? He admitted that. Basically, what we were saying at that point is, we got so big, we expanded so much, that now we don't have any choice, but we have to work. If we're going to keep up with our operations, if we're going to keep up with everything that we have taken on ourselves here, yeah, we don't have a choice. We have to work. We have to work on that one day. I thought that was quite funny, actually. He actually said, that's quite the admission. We threw the ox in the well. You have to be careful. You don't throw the ox in the well. What is or is not permitted on the day of rest? Are you working 7 days out of the week non-stop because you're trying to keep up with everything you've taken on? You may, and this is something we all got to sit down, we all got to kind of work with or between us and the Lord. Did you throw the ox in the well? Or did the ox legitimately fall in the well and now there's an actual need? Someone's sick you go help them. You don't count your steps to make sure you are past the 3,000, yet you don't go past the 3,000 foot mark. Because the person who is in trouble and needs help, they're at the 3,010 foot mark, and so you can't help them anymore. No. Those are the silly rules and regulations that the Pharisees had come up with. If someone needs help, again, mercy, compassion. We must take heed that we turn not this liberty into licentiousness and abuse God's favorable concessions and condescensions to the prejudice of the work of the day. Glenn tells me there, Allison, about what your husband would say. If you can't, and I thought of it when I was preparing for this, if you cannot make a go of farming in 6 days out of the week, a seventh will not help you.
Right.
Seventh will not help you.
So plan it.
So plan it.
Plan your week, plan your Sunday. We were in Derry, and that's very demanding, but we made it that we came to church on Sunday.
Remember, lastly, God is a God of mercy and compassion, so we should be as well. The Pharisees had zero of this. They were not compassionate towards those who were in need. The disciples are walking, they are hungry, they're traveling, and the Pharisees could care less. They're more concerned about their rigid rules and regulations. There's no, well, this person is in need here. That was the point of the law, actually. Why was it that people, when they were harvesting, if they had dropped some, they were supposed to leave it there? Because there were people in society who were in need. Why is it that the priests were even given that bread to eat? Because they were serving all the time at the temple. Their portions came not necessarily from the fields that they had. Their portions came, their needs were provided for by the offerings that were brought, and they were allowed a portion of that as well as the bread. It was to meet their need. This is kind of the spirit of the law that's underneath all of it, that runs underneath all of it. God permitted David and his men to take the consecrated bread because he had compassion on them, didn't want them to go hungry. Jesus didn't want his disciples to go hungry. His heart is for the well-being of his children and even non-Christians. And so he is merciful and compassionate toward them. So a work of necessity is allowed on the Sabbath. You're hungry? Yes, eat something. God's mercy is compassion. We know that his mercies are new every morning. The greatest example, friends, of his mercy and compassion, again, it's about human need here. We were in such trouble because of our sin. We were in need of a Savior, and so God, he sent his Son. There's the mercy and there's the compassion part right there. He looked down on us with mercy and compassion, sent his Son, so that we might not perish. It's not just that he's merciful and compassionate towards his disciples so that they don't pass out from hunger when his compassion extends so much beyond that. To our eternal well-being, he is concerned about that. We thank him for his mercy and his compassion on us. We thank him he is not like the Pharisees, who could care less if somebody went hungry on the Sabbath, as long as those rigid rules were abided by. And we too, friends, we be holy as he is holy. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus did. He was characterized by mercy and compassion, and we are to be as well. J.C. Ryle, in his commentary, I just leave you with this here. He wrote this. He was obviously not in modern times. He said, "We may drive in a carriage to minister comfort to the dying. We may stay away from public worship in order to fetch a doctor to be useful in a sick room. We may visit the fatherless and the widow in trouble. We may preach and teach and instruct the ignorant. These are works of mercy. We may do them and yet keep the Sabbath holy. These are not breaches of God's law. These are works that are works of necessity. And to do them, even on a Sabbath, is actually to keep his law, because it is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. The second greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all heart, your soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That was the point. One of the points the Pharisees just completely missed.